Today, we're going to take a break and shift our attention a little bit to what has been going on the other side of the world, because ultimately such new unfoldings will end up resounding in our economy as well. However, in this video, we're going to be focusing our attention on how the European markets are handling the crisis and what that has to do with China. Also raising some questions about what could possibly be fueling China's recent moves regarding a monumental stockpiling of all possible commodities. So stay with us, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It is very unusual to see Europe in the spotlight when it comes to its skills to cope with a crisis. Most of its countries tend to keep things out of the sight of the mass media, a lot differently from the way things are managed in here. In that sense, when breaking news about what is going on in Europe keeps emerging, it's because the pressure is certainly on. To start, we have the European Central Bank, or ECB. There have been many undercover talks on the market indicating they have decided that a global conjunction where the Fed, BOE, RBA, and RBNZ, among others, which have all signaled that things continue to freefall and much more easing can still be injected into the markets, especially in places where a second wave of the virus is undeniably occurring and where a hard Brexit is disturbingly near, would be the right setting to start selling sunny economic uplands ahead. Or at least this is the outcome the markets will perceive if we keep seeing their economic forecasts revised upwards without the seriousness the situation requires. They will consider that as a lack of reactivity from the ECB, because while everyone else is close to doing more, the ECB is not on the same tone. And the results, provided we are familiar with the narrative of buying the rumor to sell the fact, will come accordingly. Subsequently, ECB President Lagarde, who always tries to say whatever the markets want to hear, will try to persuade them about how they are still optimistic, but not so optimistic to the point that something would have to change in an undesirable way, such as the euro hitting the roof. Secondly, we have the EU trying to deal with Brexit, while the UK, on its own admission, is navigating towards acting like a rogue state and unilaterally breaking international law, as defined by Rabobank's Michael Every. A couple of days ago, there was an emergency meeting between the two sides, and the outcomes are yet to be seen. Meanwhile, the EU has been dealing with China. On his latest report, Every says that EC Executive Vice President Vestager is going to be talking to China's Liu He, and the South China Morning Post reports the latter will be offering Europe the chance to join it in its proposed new China network on data security, as opposed to the US Clean Network being the unspoken part. He explains that by taking this turn, Europe would be once again caught in the middle, and one more time, it would be trying to go its own way. As he states, in the same way Europe doesn't rely on the US in NATO and on the US dollar in the Eurodollar markets. The understudy indeed. At the same time, in another sphere, something quite intriguing is going down in China. The country disclosed that it has plans to increase its strategic commodities reserves to ease anxiety over energy and food security. The plan is foreseen to start in 2021 and is likely to include substantial purchases of crude, strategic materials, and farm goods, according to local officials. Their goal is to keep China safe and protected from any of the disruptions it has experienced this year, after floods, droughts, and pests ruined several plantations across the country and affected the Chinese food supply chain, as it has threatened the locals with food shortages in a number of cities. We've covered all of that in a previous video, and we will leave the links here for you to check that one out in case you've missed it. Moreover, it would also prevent further deterioration in trade relations with the US. All these factors would add to a shift of internal circulation, which would guarantee a greater self-reliance, which has already been pinpointed to take place in the 5-year plan from 2021 to 25. The Menifan report marked this plan as related to a slower commodity expansion. It noted that Industrial data showed that the Chinese bulk commodity market reported a more narrow expansion in August compared with July. The China Bulk Merchandise Index, which is an indicator of domestic bulk commodity market growth, came at over 100 at 102.5 in August compared to 104.8 in July, the Chinese Federation of Logistics and Purchasing said. The sub-index for bulk commodity supply and inventory moderated in August, even though it stayed in the expansion territory, as the one for bulk commodity sales reported stronger expansion. It shows that the supply pressure has been reduced and demand for commodities began to increase, showing positive changes in the domestic bulk commodity market, according to the association. However, Bloomberg's approach to the matter was much more explicit and precise. According to the report posted yesterday, the 5-year plan that will start next year will demand expansions to what he defines as mammoth state reserves of crude, farm goods, and strategic metals. According to officials who participated in the drafting of the plan, Beijing is taking into consideration all lessons learned from the health outbreak and their degraded relations with the U.S. and its allies. The authorities, who preferred to remain unidentified due to the sensitivity of the matter, pointed out that the main goal of the plan is to make sure that China's secretive stockpiles, considered to be one of the world's largest reserves, remain abundant enough to hold out against supply disruptions that could damage its economy. The strategy for 2021 to 25 will be laid out next month by China's top leadership, and it is expected to include an increase in domestic consumption and the production of more critical technology at home, in an attempt to isolate the world's second biggest economy from the deteriorating geopolitical tensions and further ruptures in supply chains. Chinese officials have disclosed that securing food supplies, fuel, and materials is a precondition of greater self-reliance for the world's biggest importer of commodities. In that way, reducing China's anxieties over energy and food security in particular will be a focus of the new buying program. As far as the amounts of goods that will be purchased, there isn't much information available to the public. As Bloomberg explained, the quantities of commodities held by the National Food and Strategic Reserves Administration aren't made public, and it doesn't report on its purchases, although details occasionally surface. However, last month a report managed to track down Chinese plans to buy 2,000 tons of cobalt, after the global sanitary crisis outlined instabilities around supplies of the strategic mineral, which is mainly used in electric vehicle batteries. The National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, is China's top economic planning agency and supervises the administration of reserves. In the first half of 2020, the agency managed to buy cheap oil after the market's massive crash, and over the past years it has purchased metals like copper to give support to domestic producers in critical times. That's how significant the Chinese presence in commodities markets is. Prices can drive up substantially on just rumors that the state stockpiler may also be a buyer. Furthermore, last Thursday there was a rise in Brent crude, and the oil contract traded in Shanghai rose. It was also reported that Chinese metals and agriculture shares also gained, with Changyi Zhangyuan Tungsten Company rising by a limit up 10%, and China Tungsten and High-Tech Materials Company adding as much as 5.8%. Additionally, the Reserves Administration documented the sales of some stockpiles, such as pork, which has been seasonally released to alleviate a domestic market distressed by African swine fever. As mentioned by two of the officials, China has already started to prepare and build some of the storage capacity that will be necessary to cover for the program to boost reserves. The plan will incorporate a directive to accelerate the construction of more facilities to hold crude, particularly in remote inland regions, they said. In April, Bloomberg reported that the Chinese government had set a target of holding oil stockpiles equivalent to 90 days of net imports, which could eventually be expanded to as much as 180 days when including commercial reserves. With all evidence on the table, those who have been following up on Chinese developments already could see how China has been capturing raw materials and strategic goods far in advance of what the economy needs at this point, which consequently means that the decline in other imports, which are overall still pretty down year over year, even including this commodity surge, is even larger. And you may be wondering, why aren't FX reserves rising even as the trade surplus soars? The answer to that is evidently tied to the huge purchase of commodities, and you can expect to hear that it will last for years. But a question that is very worth asking is, what does it really mean, such colossal stockpiles of commodities for China? What are the real reasons, not the ones the government is pointing out for us to look at? Is China already aware of the imminence of the next global crash? Because if you think about it, has there ever been a stage during trade tensions where anyone has ever threatened not to sell to China? The case is that trade partners don't exclusively want to sell raw materials and unprocessed commodities to it, but they tend to prefer to hold more of the technology and value chain themselves. That's the way things go, from Europe to the US. As Every asks in his analysis, what possible disruption could be on the horizon that would require China to have a large enough buffer of all conceivable inputs, in remote inland areas to boot, that it needs to use up its precious US dollar reserves in a bulk splurge now? The timing seems quite suspicious, and the possible answers don't seem quite right just yet. The geopolitics euphemistic exit doesn't seem to fit, because this strategy can't only be related to the ongoing concerns of the US acting on China's US dollar access, because these purchases will probably still be made using dollars, even in vast amounts, right? Or is the idea behind such a mammoth buying spree that a shift to CNY can be sped up? That's something to keep in mind for commodity sellers. It could configure a multi-year bull run and then a very sharp downturn. That is to say, in theory, after stockpiling commodities for an extensive amount of time, China wouldn't have to worry about not having enough of a certain type of good, and it could simply stop buying from the industry or the country it wants if prices were too high for 1 or even 2 years, while watching them collapse until prices were reasonable again or the assets were for sale. We're not implying that China is actually doing any of these things, but it could if it wanted to. This is geostrategies. With all the threats it has been facing, the country seems to have found a way to protect its power. What are your thoughts about it? What do you think China's next move will be? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section down below.